The morning sun cast a golden hue over the quiet suburban streets of Willow Creek, a neighborhood that prided itself on its manicured lawns, pristine sidewalks, and the ever-watchful eyes of the Homeowners Association (HOA). The tranquility of the morning was shattered by the low growl of a tow truck's engine, a sound that cut through the stillness like a knife. On his porch, retired Marine Colonel Tom Grayson sat in his favorite recliner, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The sound of chains rattling against steel snapped him to attention. His sharp eyes immediately locked onto the scene unfolding in his driveway. A young man in a reflective vest was hooking up his beloved Humvee to the tow truck. His Humvee, the same vehicle that had carried him through the deserts of Iraq, the mountains of Afghanistan, and countless other missions that had left their mark on both the vehicle and the man. Tom's boots hit the pavement before his brain fully processed what was happening. The kid operating the tow truck, barely out of his teens, glanced at him with the kind of indifference that only comes from a lifetime of being yelled at by strangers. But this wasn't just any stranger. This was a man who had led men into battle, stared down enemy fire, and faced down bureaucrats in Washington without flinching. "Son," Tom said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of decades of authority, "I'm going to need you to unhook that Humvee." The kid wiped ketchup from his mouth with the back of his hand. "Orders from the HOA, sir. Says here it's an unauthorized vehicle. Been marked for removal." Tom stepped closer, his eyes scanning the paperwork the kid held out like a shield. His name wasn't even on it. Just a generic citation claiming his Humvee was a EYESORE obstruction, and that, as a non-member of the HOA, he was subject to penalties. "You sure you want to go through with this?" Tom asked, his tone shifting just slightly. The kid hesitated. "Look, sir, I just do what they tell me. If you got a problem, take it up with the HOA." Tom didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His expression alone made the tow truck driver reconsider his entire career path. But orders were orders, and with a final glance at Tom, the kid shrugged, climbed into the truck, and drove off, hauling Tom's Humvee away like some defeated trophy. Tom stood there for a long moment, hands on his hips, staring at the empty patch of driveway where his Humvee had been. He took a slow breath, then exhaled just as slowly. He wasn't mad. Not yet. This wasn't anger. This was something far more dangerous. This was the calm before the storm. An hour later, Tom was standing in front of Edward Carmichael, the self-important president of the Willow Creek HOA. Edward was a man who had never served a day in uniform, but carried himself with the smugness of a four-star general. He sat in a ridiculous little golf cart, clipboard in hand, sipping an iced coffee like he was presiding over an empire. "Ah, Mr. Grayson," Edward said, not bothering to stand. "I was expecting you." Tom didn't return the pleasantry. "Where's my Humvee?" Edward let out a small, satisfied sigh. "Per HOA regulations, you've refused multiple requests to register as a member, and as such, your vehicle is in violation of our neighborhood standards." Tom studied him the way Edward's fingers twitched slightly when he sipped his drink, the way his eyes darted toward the housewives walking by like he was performing for an audience. This was a man who thrived on control. Tom had dealt with his type before, the kind of guy who built his identity on rules he never had to enforce himself. "You want me to pay you to live in my own house?" Tom said, deadpan. "It's not about money," Edward replied with a tight smile that suggested it was entirely about money. "It's about maintaining standards." Tom chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Standards, huh? Let me tell you about standards, Edward. I've seen men dig trenches in monsoon rains. I've watched medics hold together wounds with their bare hands because they had no supplies. I've seen soldiers fight for every inch of ground, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And you're telling me my Humvee is a threat to the standards of this cul-de-sac monarchy of yours?" Edward's smile twitched. "That's a very emovying speech, Mr. Grayson, but the fact remains." "The fact remains," Tom interrupted, stepping closer, "that you took my property without so much as a warning. And that means you and I have a problem." Edward finally shifted in his seat, as if realizing for the first time that Tom was not just another homeowner to push around. He cleared his throat and straightened his clipboard. "You're welcome to appeal the decision at the next HOA meeting." Tom stared at him. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. "Fine," Tom finally said. "I'll appeal." Edward blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the sudden compliance. "Well, good. That's how things should be done around here, through proper channels." Tom nodded, then smiled. And that was the moment Edward should have realized he had made a mistake. That night, Tom sat on his porch with a beer, watching the neighborhood. People had been talking, whispering. Some gave him sympathetic nods. Others pretended not to see him at all. That was fine. He wasn't interested in sympathy. He was interested in results. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Shadow," he said when the voice on the other end picked up. "Tom," the voice replied. "Been a while. You finally need my service, yes." Tom's smile widened. "I need some intel. HOA leadership, financials, emails, anything that smells like corruption." A pause, then a low chuckle. "You really don't do small fights, do you?" "Never have. Never will," Tom said, taking another sip of beer. "Let's see what Edward Carmichael is really hiding." The game had begun. Tom arrived at the impound lot just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over rows of confiscated vehicles. The place smelled of grease and desperation, the kind of place where people came to beg for their cars back, only to be met with blank stares and sky-high fees. He had been in worse places: war zones, enemy territory, congressional hearings. This was just another battlefield. A teenager sat behind the counter, slumped in his chair, scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up when Tom approached. "Towing receipts," the kid muttered. Tom placed his hands on the counter. "I'm here for my Humvee." The kid yawned and finally looked at him. "Got a citation number?" Tom handed over the crumpled paper the tow truck driver had left him. The kid typed lazily into his computer, his gums smacking loudly. After a few seconds, he nodded toward the back lot. "Yeah, it's here. Gonna be a due lot 200 release fee." Tom didn't flinch. "I'm not paying." The kid sighed, clearly used to this kind of pushback. "Look, man, I don't make the rules. If you got a problem, take it up with the HOA." Tom leaned in just slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Listen carefully, son. That Humvee has been through more battles than your entire family tree. It's carried wounded men through enemy fire, outrun mortar strikes, and served YVED places the news won't even report on. And you're telling me some neighborhood pencil pusher gets to decide whether I can have it back?" The kid swallowed. "Look, Before he could finish, a heavy voice rumbled from behind the gate. "Tom Grayson." Tom turned, his face breaking into a grin. A stocky man in oil-stained coveralls stepped out from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. The man had a scar running down his left cheek and the unmistakable presence of someone who had seen real action. "Murphy," Tom said. "Didn't think I'd see you again outside a war zone." Murphy chuckled, stepping forward and shaking Tom's hand with a grip like a VYC. "Heard about what happened?" "HOA nonsense." Tom nodded. "They took my Humvee." Murphy snorted, shaking his head. "Unbelievable. CIVY liens get a little bit of power, and suddenly they think they're running a dictatorship." Tom tilted his head toward the lot. "Any chance you can help me out here?" Murphy grinned. "For you? No charge." The kid at the desk stammered. "Wait, but..." Murphy waved him off. "Relax, kid. This man has done more for this country than your entire HOA put together. If you got a problem, tell your boss I said so." The kid shut his mouth. 10 minutes later, Tom was behind the wheel of his Humvee, the engine purring like a beast finally set free. He gripped the steering wheel, rolling his shoulders as he took in the familiar feel of it. The battle wasn't over. It was just getting started. By the time he got home, the wheels in his mind were already turning. He parked the Humvee conspicuously on his driveway, making sure it was visible from every angle. If the HOA wanted to challenge him again, they'd have to do it to his face. Inside, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and settled into his chair. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Shadow," the voice on the other end answered. "Need a favor," Tom said. There was a brief pause before Shadow chuckled. "Must be serious if you're calling me." Tom exhaled. "I need everything on the HOA leadership. Financials, emails, any dirt you can find. Give me an hour." Tom hung up and sipped his drink, watching the street through his window. He had been in enough battles to know when an enemy was getting overconfident. The HOA thought they had won by towing his Humvee. They had no idea who they were dealing with. His phone buzzed exactly an hour later. "Tom," Shadow's voice came through. "You're going to love this." Tom smirked. "What do you got?" "Your HOA president, Edward Carmichael, has been funneling neighborhood fees into a personal account, charging extra for beautification projects that never happened. Overbilling residents for repairs that don't exist. The guy's a walking scandal. Tom's smirk widened. Send me everything. Already in your inbox. Tom opened his laptop and scrolled through the files Shadow had sent. Bank statements, emails, a full breakdown of how Edward had been lining his pockets while pretending to be some law-abiding leader of the community. Tom leaned back in his chair, considering his next move. He could go straight to the residence, expose Edward in front of everyone, but that would be too easy. No, this required something more tactical. The next morning, Tom went to work. He made a few more calls, reached out to a few contacts: local veterans, retired law enforcement officers, people who had no patience for bureaucratic crooks. He didn't need an army. He just needed the right people in the right places. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, Tom was ready. The community center was packed, tension hanging in the air as Edward Carmichael stood at the front, his usual smug expression barely concealing the unease in his eyes. He had heard the rumors. He knew something was coming. Tom waited until the meeting was in full swing before standing up. "I have a question," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Edward sighed. "Mr. Grayson, if this is about your vehicle." "This is about you," Tom interrupted. "Specifically, how you've been using HOA funds for personal gain." A murmur spread through the crowd. Edward scoffed. "That's a ridiculous accusation." Tom held up a folder. "Bank statements say otherwise." Silence. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. "Is this true, Edward?" Edward tried to regain control. "This is obviously some kind of misunderstanding. I can explain." Tom stepped forward. "Save it. You've been charging people for non-existent projects. You've been embezzling funds while threatening homeowners with fines and citations. And I've got the proof right here." Edward's face turned a deep shade of red. This is an invasion of privacy." Tom smiled. "Funny. That's exactly what I thought when you stole my Humvee." The room erupted. Homeowners shouted questions, demanding answers. The board members whispered among themselves, distancing themselves from Edward with every passing second. Tom stepped back, watching the chaos unfold. This wasn't his battle anymore. He had delivered the strike. The neighborhood would take care of the rest. As the meeting ended in a flurry of accusations and panic, Tom walked out, hands in his pockets, whistling to himself. Edward Carmichael had spent years treating the HOA like his personal kingdom. Now, his empire was crumbling. Edward had always been a man who thrived on control. For years, he had ruled the HOA like a king, wielding citations and fines like weapons. But now, standing in front of a room full of angry homeowners, his power was slipping through his fingers. His carefully constructed empire was unraveling, and the worst part was that he had no idea how to stop it. Tom watched from the back of the room, arms crossed, as residents bombarded Edward with questions he couldn't answer. Where had their money gone? Why had fees increased while nothing in the neighborhood had actually improved? Why were some homeowners getting special treatment while others were getting their cars towed for no reason? Edward stammered through half-hearted explanations, but no one was buying it. The board members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, realizing that their names were tied to this sinking ship. One of them, an older woman with sharp eyes and a lifetime of experience reading people, finally spoke up. "Edward," she asked, her voice cutting through the chaos, "is it true? Did you misuse HOA funds?" Edward opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence that followed was deafening. Tom smirked to himself. He had seen this before in a different setting, a leader caught red-handed, trying to save face. But the room had already turned against him. There was no winning this fight. Edward was done, and he knew it. "I think we should vote," another board member said. Effective immediately. It wasn't even a debate. The votes came in, and just like that, Edward Carmichael was removed as HOA president. His face had gone pale, his hands clenched into fists as he tried to process the sudden downfall. 1 minute, he had been the king of the cul-de-sac. The next, he was just another homeowner with no power. Tom stepped forward, just close enough for Edward to hear him. "Looks like you've been overthrown." Edward turned sharply, eyes filled with rage. "You think you've won?" Tom shrugged. "I think justice won." Edward scoffed, shaking his head. "You have no idea what you've done." Tom leaned in slightly. "Oh, I know exactly what I've done. I made sure people like you don't get to push people like me around." Edward had no comeback. He stormed out of the meeting, his face red with anger and embarrassment. The moment the door slammed behind him, the tension in the room released all at once. Homeowners started talking to each other, some relieved, some still shocked at how quickly everything had unraveled. Tom didn't stick around to hear the aftermath. His job was done. By the time he made it back home, he could already feel the weight lifting off his shoulders. He parked his Humvee in the driveway, standing there for a moment just to admire it. The whole mess had started because of this vehicle, and now it sat exactly where it belonged. Tom wasn't even inside for 10 minutes before his doorbell rang. He opened it to find one of the former board members, the same older woman who had been sharp enough to see through Edward's nonsense. "Mr. Grayson," she said with a small smile. "That was quite the performance back there." Tom nodded. "I just pointed out the facts." "Well," she folded her arms, "I think we could use someone like you." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Oh, we're going to need a new HOA president. Someone who understands leadership. Someone who knows how to stand up to corruption." Tom almost laughed. "You want me to run the HOA? Not run it. Fix it." Tom thought about it. He had spent his entire life leading people, commanding forces, fighting battles. And now, in retirement, he had planned on taking it easy. But then again, he had always believed in doing what was right. If that meant stepping up one more time, so be it. "I'll consider it," he said finally. She smiled, giving him a knowing nod. "That's all we ask." As she walked away, Tom glanced back at his Humvee battle-worn machine that had carried him through so much. He had thought his days of fighting were over. Maybe they never really were. Maybe some battles just took a different shape. A few days later, Edward Carmichael packed up and left town. No one knew exactly where he went, and no one really cared. His house went up for sale, and the neighborhood began to change. Just little things at first. People actually started talking to each other, working together instead of levying under the threat of fines and penalties. Tom sat on his porch one evening, sipping a beer, watching the sunset over the neighborhood he had unexpectedly helped save. He had faced down corrupt officials, hostile forces, and impossible odds before, but taking down an HOA had been one for the books. As he leaned back, stretching his legs, he heard a familiar voice from the street. "You going to run things differently, General?" Tom looked up to see Murphy standing there, arms crossed, grinning. Tom raised his bottle in a mock toast. "I figure I'll take it one battle at a time." Murphy chuckled. "Well, if you need reinforcements, you know where to find me." Tom nodded. He had always known that war never really ended. The battlefield just changed. And for now, at least, this was one fight he had won. He took another sip of his beer and let out a slow breath. Peace at last. At least until the next idiot tried something stupid. The weeks following Edward Carmichael's downfall were a whirlwind of change for Willow Creek. The neighborhood, once stifled under the iron grip of the HOA, began to breathe again. Residents who had barely spoken to each other for years now gathered in driveways, sharing stories and laughter. The sense of community that had been suffocated by Edward's petty rules and fines was slowly being revived. Tom Grayson, however, remained cautious. He had seen enough in his life to know that power vacuums could be dangerous. Even in a small suburban neighborhood like Willow Creek, there was always someone waiting to step into the void left by a fallen leader. And while the residents had rallied against Edward, Tom knew that not everyone had pure intentions. The older woman who had approached Tom after the meeting, Margaret Maggie Thompson, was elected as the interim HOA president. She was a no-nonsense retired schoolteacher with a sharp mind and a reputation for fairness. Maggie had been one of the few board members who had resisted Edward's corruption, and the neighborhood trusted her to lead them through the transition. But Maggie wasn't interested in staying in power for long. At the next HOA meeting, she made her intentions clear. "I'm not here to run this neighborhood indefinitely," she said, addressing the packed community center. "We need fresh leadership, someone who understands what it means to serve, not to control." The room buzzed with murmurs. Eyes turned toward Tom, who sat in the back, arms crossed, observing quietly. He had been expecting this. "Tom Grayson," Maggie said, turning to him. "The floor is yours." Tom stood, his presence commanding immediate silence. He hadn't planned on speaking, but he knew this was his moment to set the tone for what came next. "I didn't come back to Willow Creek to fight another war," he began, his voice steady. "But I'll be damned if I sit back and watch this neighborhood fall apart again. If you want me to lead, I'll lead. But not as a dictator. Not as someone who tells you what color to paint your house or how high your grass can grow. I'll lead as someone who believes in this community and all of you." The room erupted into applause. Tom raised a hand to quiet them. "But here's the deal," he continued. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. If we want to keep this neighborhood strong, we need to work together. No more petty squabbles. No more hiding behind rules to settle personal grudges. We're better than that." The residents nodded in agreement. For the first time in years, there was a sense of unity in Willow Creek. But not everyone was happy with the changes. As Tom and Maggie worked to rebuild trust and transparency within the HOA, whispers began to circulate about a small group of residents who had benefited from Edward's corruption. They had enjoyed special treatment, lower fees, exemptions from fines, and even kickbacks from Edward's embezzlement scheme. With Edward gone, they were losing their privileges, and they weren't going down without a fight. One evening, as Tom was reviewing the HOA's financial records with Maggie, his phone buzzed. It was Murphy. "You've got trouble," Murphy said without preamble. "Some of the old guard are planning something. They're not happy about losing their perks." Tom sighed. "Figures. Any idea what they're up to?" "Not yet," Murphy replied. "But I'll keep an ear to the ground. You watch your back, Tom. These people play dirty." Tom thanked him and hung up. He shared the news with Maggie, who frowned. "I was afraid of this," she said. "Edward had his loyalists. They're not going to let go of their power easily." Tom nodded. "Then we'll be ready." The first sign of trouble came a few days later. Early one morning, Tom received a frantic call from one of the neighborhood's maintenance workers. "Mr. Grayson, you need to see this," the man said, his voice shaking. Tom rushed to the community park, where a crowd had already gathered. The playground equipment, a recent addition funded by the HOA, had been vandalized. Swastikas and profanities were spray-painted across the slides and swings, and the swings themselves had been cut down. The residents were outraged. Children cried as their parents tried to shield them from the sight. Tom clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "This isn't just vandalism," Maggie said quietly, standing beside him. "This is a message." Tom nodded. "They're trying to scare us, to make us think we can't handle this." "What do we do?" Maggie asked. Tom turned to the crowd. "We clean it up, and we show them that we're not afraid." The residents rallied together, and within hours, the park was restored. But Tom knew this was only the beginning. The sabotage didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, more incidents occurred. Lawns were poisoned, cars were keyed, and anonymous threats were left in mailboxes. The neighborhood was on edge, and Tom knew he had to act fast. With Murphy's help, Tom identified the ringleader of the group, a man named Carl Hendricks, a former board member who had been one of Edward's closest allies. Carl had been quietly stirring up dissent, spreading rumors, and organizing the attacks. Tom confronted Carl one evening, catching him in the act of slashing tires on a neighbor's car. "You're done, Carl," Tom said, his voice cold. Carl sneered. "You think you can stop us? You're just one man." Tom stepped closer, his eyes locked on Carl's. "I've faced worse than you, and I've never lost." Carl hesitated, then dropped the knife and fled. With Carl's arrest, the sabotage stopped. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief, and the sense of unity that had been growing only strengthened. Tom and Maggie worked together to implement new policies that prioritized transparency and community involvement. The HOA became a force for good, organizing events and initiatives that brought residents closer together. Tom, true to his word, stepped down as HOA president after a year, passing the torch to Maggie. But he remained an active member of the community, always ready to lend a hand or offer advice. Years later, Tom sat on his porch, sipping a beer and watching the sunset. The neighborhood had flourished under the new leadership, and the scars of Edward's reign had faded. Children played in the park, neighbors chatted over fences, and the sense of community was stronger than ever. Murphy joined him, as he often did, and the two men sat in comfortable silence. "You did good, Tom," Murphy said finally. "You gave this place a second chance." Tom smiled. "We all did. It wasn't just me." Murphy raised his bottle in a toast. "To the battles we win in, the ones we don't have to fight." Tom clinked his bottle against Murphy's. "To peace." And for the first time in a long time, Tom felt truly at ease. The war was over, and the battlefield had finally become a home. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.